All right, welcome back to the second video of section 2 for the Scrape the Planet course. My name is Mitchell Edwards. I'm your instructor for this course. If you missed the last section on what scrapers are, or if you missed section 1, the introduction about what this course is all about, my experience in this course, all of that fun stuff, I highly recommend going back and looking at that. It's kind of like important information going forward. All of this is going to build like a snowball rolling downhill on top of itself. So if you kind of miss a little bit, you're not going to gain the same amount of momentum as you would if you kind of watched all of this sequentially, or at least watch most of it. Let's get into what scrapers are on kind of a technical level. What is a page scraper specifically? That's going to be what we talk about in this section. So let's kind of review. What are scrapers? Scrapers are essentially programs that do exactly what the human does when surfing the web, but they do it lightning fast and remember things very, very well. They can be built to log in, read and store posts, switch to a new page or a profile. They can, even log into like banking websites with hopefully your own information and get information about how much money you've got into your account, all of that fun stuff. They interact with web pages in the same way that a normal user would, meaning that any of the buttons that you can click on a web page, page scrapers can also click on a web page. Page scrapers scrape the page. Anything that's on the page, web scrapers or page scrapers specifically can interact with. These are actually not the best kinds of scrapers. They're more prone to breakages, and we'll talk about that here in a second. And they're a little bit less efficient, but they are incredibly powerful because they can do all of the things that a normal user can do. They can be built to parse dozens of pages at a time with multi-threading or just kind of a very fast and efficient scraper design. And they can put all of that data into a complex database, or it can just pull down one small piece of data from a web page and display it to the developer. I mean, literally these things can be as simple or as complicated as you want them to be. They can actually, like I said, be very difficult to build and maintain. Because web page scrapers are built to consume HTML code and parse it for useful data, they have to be custom built for each individual web page and website. So if I have a particular web page, we have a particular web page. That web page at its core is made up of HTML code. HTML. And this is the code that your browser is going to look at to display all of the fancy images and stuff like that to you. So within these HTML pages, there's just dozens and dozens of lines of code. And you really, it's just super ugly to look at. But within these web pages, there are what are called tags. And we're going to take H1 as an example. I'll flash up an example of an H1 kind of like logo or an H1 header. This is a header. So that's an H1, and I'll pop up what that looks like on screen real quick. An H1 is a particular kind of tag, and what these tags do is they tell the browser how to display data. They are also how page scrapers look for data within a web page. So if I am looking for the header of this web page, I'm going to look for an H1. The problem is there might be 5 or 6 H1s. There might be 1,000 H1s. And you really don't want all of them. You just want the one that says this is a header, or the one that has a particular stock price in it or something like that. And what these tags come with, if you've developed any HTML code in your lives, they come with IDs, and they come with classes, and they come with all kinds of stuff like that. Class equals target. So we've got one H1 here, and it's got some information. And then we've got another one that says H1 class equals blah. So this has got useless information in it. We don't want it. So if we're specifically just looking For this one right here, the one that has the class of target, we're going to tell our page scraper, hey, I would like to find an H1 with a class of target. And we'll get into exactly how to do that later on when we start talking about Beautiful Soup. Beautiful Soup is the Python library that we're actually going to be using to parse through this data. Now, what happens if, sometime down the line, the company that develops this web page that we're scraping decides to hire a new developer, and they look at this web page and they say, this H1 header right here that has the class of target, I don't really like that. I'm going to change it to target with a capital T, just to kind of make everybody else mad, especially the people developing scrapers. The problem with page scrapers is that's going to break your code, because you are looking for target with a lowercase t. Now all of a sudden the data that you want is within an H1 tag that has a capital T. It literally can be that easy to break them. It could be something even more major. Let's say they decide an H1 header is a little bit too big. Let's make it an H2 header with a class that's exactly the same. So it still has lowercase t, but now you have to tell your scraper, hey, instead of an H1, we need to look for an H2. This can get so annoying. I was actually working on a project when I was in college that was scraping a Chinese social media site that really ended up not liking me. And I was pulling down these posts looking for signs of censorship. And what they did these various different things to kind of make it more difficult to scrape their web pages. One of them was kind of like banning my IPs. That's kind of like brute forcey though, and like ugly, and they didn't really want to start doing that, especially since I was using proxies. So instead, they just started changing little aspects of their code. They started changing this here to a different class. They started changing the IDs. So an H1 might have a class of target and an ID of important. And the reason why an ID is important is that there can only be one element on a web page with a specific ID. That is incredibly important because if you're just looking for things in classes, you could have like 17,000 different things that all have the same exact class name, target. But only one item on a web page is a specific ID. So if you're looking for a very specific piece of data and you only want the one instance of it, you want to look for its ID instead of its class. But we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Basically what this site was doing was they would change like their class names, they would change their ID names, they would change like little pieces of structure of their site in order to make life a lot more difficult for me. The developers of web pages aren't necessarily trying to make your life more difficult, but they've got human changes. They want to, all of a sudden change the kind of style of their web page, or they hire somebody new who just doesn't like the class names or the way that they're writing the class names. All of this stuff is very typical stuff. While we're talking about website maintainers, they're actually a very, very important part of this class. Web page scrapers are very unpopular for website maintainers. They create a lot of traffic, which can affect website performance. Like I said earlier, we're going to start talking about the ethics and legality of web scraping and kind of the different issues with that. And one of those issues is that since you're sending all of these requests way faster than a human can do it, websites are built most of the time for normal humans to interact with. Normal humans only going to click a couple of links every minute or so, while a machine is going to do things very fast. It's going to send tons of traffic. So web page scrapers send a lot more traffic than their counterparts in the API scraping world. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but these are a lot less efficient. They're going to send way more requests, request way more data, and they could potentially crash a site. Like I said, we'll go over the ethics and legality and all of that fun stuff later on, actually relatively soon, now that I look at kind of the schedule here. So we'll go over that a little bit, in the future, but in general, web page scrapers are a lot less efficient than their counterparts in the next section and API scrapers, but a lot of times they're the only option. Some of my very favorite projects, both spiders and scrapers, have been web page scrapers. They're a lot of fun. A lot of times They're specifically the projects where you have to build out web page scrapers because the people who maintain the site don't necessarily want you to have that data. But you know, that's kind of been my like right-wing extremism work. My research on that side has been on forums that don't really like people who are trying to research right-wing extremism. Web page scrapers are great though, because essentially any site that a human can visit in their browser can be scraped with a web page scraper. So later on, when we talk about APIs in the next video of this section, we're going to talk about APIs. Not every site is going to have an API, but every site is going to have a website. So any site that you can visit in your browser, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Reddit, all of your forums, you know, those are all going to be sites that you could potentially build a web page scraper for. Some of them have built-in safeguards like CAPTCHA prompts and Cloudflare automated activity detection solutions that can hamper scrapers and other automated activity. But there are quite a few ways that you can get around that. Not going to spend too much time in this video. Not going to spend too much time in this course talking about ways that you can get around that because I don't really want to get in trouble and I don't want you to get in trouble. But there are ways to get around it. A lot of times it just kind of requires the developer to slow down the amount of requests per second that they're sending, or you know, something along those lines. Smaller sites like blogs usually lack these protections and are therefore easier to scrape. Page scrapers are actually a really great way to learn how to develop scrapers and how to learn how websites work. Since you have to interact with the HTML itself, you're going to kind of like inherently learn a lot about how websites are built and how scrapers work. We're mainly going to actually be focusing on page scrapers in this course because API scrapers are frankly very easy to do, especially once you understand kind of like the inner workings of requests and things like that. But we will talk a little bit about APIs and API scrapers in the next video of this section. Since there are inefficiencies of page scrapers, and because they tend to piss off web developers a lot, you should definitely build an API scraper when it's available. That's why we're going to be talking about it in this course. That's why I'm going to be showing you a lot of stuff on the whiteboard about API scraping and things like that. But in cases where that's not an option that's available to you, page scrapers are a really valuable addition to your toolkit. So that's really about it on the subject of page scrapers. They're incredibly important. They're going to be what we're going to be spending like the lion's share of this course on. And you know, even though they've got their issues that you kind of have to be aware of, they're awesome and they're very, very powerful. In the next section, we're going to go over APIs and API scrapers. That's kind of like the like related cousin of page scrapers, the much more efficient, much more attractive cousin. So we're going to talk about APIs and API scrapers in the next section. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have enjoyed this course so far and you're watching it on Udemy, I would really appreciate it if you started writing out kind of like a course review. If you have some issues with some of the content, if I didn't do something right, if the editing was bad, or if I was unclear on something, I would definitely love it if you gave me some feedback. But if you would like to wait until the end of the course to give me a review, positive or negative, please just leave a review. It actually helps me out a lot in developing future content and in kind of marketing this course and figuring out exactly what it is it's missing. Thank you guys. Appreciate it so much. Take it easy.